Here, and we officially start the conference, and it's a pleasure to pass the word to the Rector of the University of Urbino, Vilberto Stocchi.
Thank you, Yuri. Dear colleagues and international guests, a warm welcome to Urbino and to the conference on the ideal city between myth and reality. This is the closing highlight of our academic year, and Urbino is probably one of the most appropriate places to have a conference on this topic. The ideal city has been at the core of Renaissance and Urbino, even though for a short period of time has been one of the most important capitals of Renaissance, putting forward the ideal city idea with its Duke Federico di Montefeltro, one of the most successful warlords of the 15th century, investing in art, science, and knowledge in the broader sense. When the Duke Federico built his palazzo, which I hope you will visit, I strongly suggest to all of you to visit the Ducal Palace, a real masterpiece of Renaissance time, where you could admire inside beautiful paintings made by Raffaello, Piero della Francesca. The Ducal Palace was the technologically most advanced building at the time, with drinking water through complex coal filters and hot water for the Duchess's bathroom. It transformed Urbino in one of the most important cultural and artistic centers of the Renaissance. Urbino's history shows that visioning is a resurgent ideal also in more recent times, with the university playing an important part in that process. Indeed, for long the city and the university have been in a privileged dialogue with Carlo Bo and Giancarlo De Carlo, playing key roles. The first was rector of the University of Urbino from 1947 to 2001, uninterruptedly, for 54 years, a unique case in the world history, and our university is named after him. The second was an Italian architect who started working in Urbino in 1952 and continued being involved in shaping the city up to 1989. That is for 47 years. Besides preparing two master plan of Urbino, 1958 and 1989, De Carlo designed the students' dorm, 1963, the Faculty of Law, 1962, this building, 1968, where we are having this conference, and the one of the Faculty of Economics, 1999, just to mention the main projects involving the University of Urbino. In his work, De Carlo wasn't interested in putting forward a mere historical preservation of dated forms. He thought that forms can stimulate new organizational requirements and suggest the image of new functions. This building, for example, was a convent, then an orphanage, and only much later the venue of the Faculty of Sociology. He incorporated the new into the old, rather than destroying or imitating the old, reorganizing physical space and building the frame for a dialogue between old and new. Moreover, his concern was the townscape as a whole, rather than a single buildings. Carlo Bo defined De Carlo someone who unveils even before being someone who builds. They shared a visionary attitude and saw in the university the single most vital force for the recovery of Urbino from its decline after the Renaissance. In those years, Urbino became a laboratory of experimentation, and De Carlo was a key figure in putting forward discourse and practice of participation in architecture. One of the first in the field of architecture at the end of the 60s. It balanced an enormous respect and care for heritage with being open to technological advances, emphasizing, however, the responsibility of the architect and the necessary relationship between practice and theory. In this cultural context, which emerged during the post-war economic boom, the University of Urbino grew substantially from 136 students in 1936 to more than 10,000 students in the 60s and more than 20,000 of students in the 80s. This growth brought about wealth to the city, but challenged the city's economic and demographic structure. As you have probably noted, the consumption patterns are those of a student-oriented city. The population of city users, as Guido Martinotti, the most prominent Italian urban sociologist who died a few years ago, calls students, tourists, and the like, is challenging the ideal city of Urbino in different ways. It poses issues of participation and democracy. It is a population contributing to the economic fabric of the city, but it is not involved in any decision-making process. It has different ways of experiencing and living the city as its inhabitants. They both depend on each other, but there is no common arena to address together emerging issues. All the challenges this situation poses in a microcosmos of Urbino are actually challenges which characterize cities in general as the ideal relational place where people come together and confront each other with conflict, with resistance, with power asymmetries, but also with encounter of others and diversity, finding and experimenting solutions to emerging issues. Reading the program of the conference, I saw that you are addressing these challenges in comparative terms, both theoretically and empirically. This is a big contribution in understanding how built environment shapes and is shaped by relationality, how the ideal, the plan shapes and is shaped by the social, how all dimensions interact and produce unexpected and unplanned results. It is a great pleasure to have all of you here discussing these issues and challenges, and the university providing the context for it. I wish you a fruitful exchange of ideas and very much look forward to the results of our discussion. I wish to all of you a pleasant stay in Urbino. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Eduardo Marques, RC21 President.
Hello, buonasera a tutti. Unfortunately, these will be the only words in Italian I'm going to speak now, because my Italian is not good enough for this task. So, good afternoon. I have the pleasure of welcoming you to this wonderful city of Urbino and the honor of opening the 2015 conference of the Research Committee 21 of the International Sociological Association. I would like to start by thanking, in the name of the RC21, the institutions that made this conference possible. The city of Urbino, the municipality of Urbino, for the organizational support for social events, the Department of Economy, Society and Politics for organizational support and sponsorship, the Regional Authority for the Rights of Education for providing convenient accommodations for many conference delegates, the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research for financial and scientific support, the High School of Art and Design for the organizational support in graphic design and locations, and most of all, for the University of Urbino Carlo Bo for the organizational support, venue, and sponsorship. Thank you. Well, the conference focuses on the multiple dialogues between myth and reality in the ideal city, unfolding into discussions about the many relations between imagined cities, plans, meanings of spaces, and the daily practices and actions of the inhabitants. My role here was just to welcome you and open the conference, but I couldn't resist the temptation of saying some words and showing some images, just some, of Brazil, my home country, considering the theme of the conference, as an inspiration for what we are going to discuss in the following days. Okay. As you might know, the capital of Brazil is a planned city constructed by scratch at the end of the 50s, and it's not called Buenos Aires. This is the capital of the neighbor. It's called Brasilia, and started like this, just across, which became progressively two axes, a straight and a curved one, and later became a broad urban form figure. Then it became this, a plan, produced with strong functional separation of urban activities, following strictly the provisions of modernist urbanism, which had the ambition of regulating very strongly urban life and possibly producing the ideal city. Then it became this. Only the indicated area of this satellite image, however, was planned originally. The city should reach 500,000 inhabitants at its peak, but it already hosted 2.5 million in 2010. Even the originally planned space has been deeply changed and resignified by the daily practices of the persons who live and give life to the city. Since ancient times, people produce projects and plans to organize their cities. Even before that, however, city inhabitants have built, transformed, and appropriated their spaces to daily life's activities and practices. Cities are, after all, the ever-changing product of historical heritages, imaginations, social and political practices, plans, and projects. And this leads me to my second Brazilian image, a favela. These are seen as the materialization of urban chaos, of absence of structure and order. Although they really summarize urban social inequalities, they are far from being places of enemy and lack of structure, at least in the Brazilian case. This image of the daily sociability, the network of the daily sociability of the inhabitants in one of them in São Paulo is enough to reject any narrative of social enemy. Favelas also have a system of streets, alleys, and squares constructed vernacularly by the inhabitants, but also by the state. These are, in fact, what makes slum upgrading possible, guaranteeing both infrastructure and location to the inhabitants without a plan, regional at least. So people organize their lives, their spaces of living, even in the absences of plans and projects. In fact, people may organize their spaces of living in a very structured way, even in the absence of centralized political power. And this leads me to my last Brazilian image, a Kayapó village. In it, large houses inhabited by extended families surround a large central and almost vacant square, except for a large ritual construction. When people marry, men move from their extended family's house to the house of their wives. The center of the village is associated with public and political life and the activities of men, while the houses are the domain of women, kinship, and reciprocity. Space is organized, expressing the two halves of the world for them: men, women, center, periphery, public, private. The combination of these The spatial organizations of the houses and the square, and the marriage practices that produce movements between houses, connect the families and the village space together in a deeply structured way. Therefore, even in the absence of plan and in the absence of centralized power. Therefore, forms of social organization, imagined spaces, physical constructions, and social practices are always in association with each other. To explore the multiple connections between these elements is the main goal of this conference, discussing both classical urban themes such as social justice, conflicts, welfare, planning, housing, informality in daily practices and policies, and recent debates on governance, diversity, smart cities, sustainability, and climate change, among others. We could not have a better place to do this than Urbino, a city deeply rooted in plans and urbanism, and also in urban life since the Renaissance. Let's be inspired by this wonderful scenario and make this an intellectually challenging and personally gratifying conference and experience. Good work to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maurizio Gambini, Mayor of Urbino.
Sì, buongiorno a tutti. Io parlerò in italiano, mi dispiace, mi aiuterà per la traduzione.
Welcome everybody. Unfortunately, I will speak only in Italian, but we will support him.
Vi porto il mio saluto personale della nostra città e di tutti i nostri cittadini, perché per noi è un onore e un privilegio ospitare un convegno come avete organizzato. Ringrazio quindi l'Università di Urbino, l'ISIA, ma soprattutto chi ha organizzato questo evento.
We are very happy to welcome you here. We are very proud, and it's a privilege to have you here. And I welcome everybody in this city, and I don't remember exactly what else. But I thank all the organizers and the university who is hosting this conference.
Mi ha aiutato molto a descrivere la nostra città, il nostro magnifico rettore, che devo dire in tutte le attività della nostra città, del nostro territorio, dà un contributo importante come università e il suo personale, e per questo lo ringrazio.
The relationship with the university is quite a key relationship, and I'm very thankful to the Rector, who personally and as an institution is supporting the city in all its activities.
Oggi, questi giorni, voi ci onorate della vostra presenza, tutti quanti. Spero che tutti siete arrivati bene, anche se arrivare nella nostra città non è facile. Quindi è chiaramente un'impresa già arrivare a Urbino, anche se, come ha descritto prima il magnifico rettore Stocchi, la nostra città vale la pena di essere vista, quindi spero che questo sia stato piacevole.
So I hope it was not too complicated to get to Urbino. We know it's not that easy, but it's probably worth coming, and for this we thank you for being here.
Chiaramente siamo onorati di avere e lusingati di avere la presenza di questo convegno su temi così importanti come quelli che andrete a discutere nelle diverse sezioni di queste giornate, e il risultato chiaramente sarà a noi prezioso anche come amministratori per poter capire l'orientamento che dobbiamo avere per gestire meglio la nostra città.
We are also happy about the topic of the conference, and we hope we can gain out of the results of your discussions some insights for future work and planning and activities in the city.
Ecco, è chiaro che la nostra città, il nostro territorio, in confronto alle altre sedi di questa iniziativa, è una città piccola, ma diciamo per eccellenza la città ideale, quindi diciamo cogliamo anche questa nostra storia per dare delle indicazioni del benessere, del vivere, della convivenza. Cioè chiaramente in un momento come questo di crisi mondiale dobbiamo ripensare a come gestirci meglio, e quindi tutti quanti noi siamo umilmente a capire qual è la direzione giusta, e quindi dagli esperti come siete voi, sicuramente come amministratori dobbiamo riuscire a cogliere quelli che sono i risultati e il pensiero un po' di una convivenza migliore per creare meno impatto possibile per far vivere meglio le nostre popolazioni.
The venue is probably an appropriate venue for the topic, and also in times of crisis we need to get your insight to understand how to address in an inclusionary way the process of change and the negative impact on the social dimensions which most of the people are facing in that moment. So we are very much looking forward for your insights.
E quindi al di là del risultato tecnico che verrà fuori da quel lavoro di questi giorni, spero che facciate un buon soggiorno al di là del lavoro che dovrete fare, che quindi anche i momenti liberi siano di vostro gradimento e viviate bene il nostro territorio e la nostra città. Grazie a tutti per aver partecipato.
So besides the technicalities and the scientific debate, I hope you will enjoy the city and you will have a wonderful time in this nice place. Have
Grazie.
a good work. My translation was a bit not word to word. I tried to summarize a bit. Okay, so now it's my turn, so I don't have to introduce myself. So I would very much like to welcome you. We were in contact all the time, 6,000 emails with Eduardo. We managed even 5 minutes ago, can you please change my presentation online? It's probably by far the largest C21 conference in the last few decades, even larger than Berlin, and which was already the largest in the last decade. So, and we are very pleased about this, but we are a bit overwhelmed. And I would like to start my short welcome, well, not that short, but I would like to start with thanking very much Eduardo Barberis, who helped me managing everything. So, without him, it would have been really very, very complicated. Also in particular because we have an attitude, which we share, of having a problem-solving oriented mind, which is not always the case, I have to say. So why is this success? I have a few points. I try to think about a whole range of reasons, and one might be, for instance, the challenging topic. It's a nice topic, it's an interesting topic, it's an engaging topic, because you contrast visions, ideas, plans on one side and realities on the other. And RC21 is always engaged in the fact that these two dimensions are in a constant dialogue and are shaping our lives. It's not the plan which makes our lives, it's not the rest, it's the interaction out of them. And we are very happy about this, and we think that we need the plan. We need visions, we need ideas, we need new utopias, but we need also action for new realities. So the interaction between these two dimensions is for sure an issue we are happy to address here. And also because we need to disentangle the complex Chinese boxes between ideal and real. The nested nature of the meaning of ideal. The Renaissance that was mentioned by our rector in his welcome address was supposed to be universal at that time. So the ideal city in the Renaissance was a very specific idea. But actually also the meaning of ideal might change. It might change over time, it might change over space, over culture, even within disciplines. Even within the same discipline across countries. A geographer from India or China or the United States or Germany or Austria might have a completely different idea what an ideal city is. So context sensitivity of what is ideal makes ideal relative, or at least partly relative. Is the ideal city an ethnocentric concept? Or is there a shared basis on some key analytical elements of what an ideal should be? I will leave this question to the sessions, so I won't answer that, of course. And I will leave it also to the final plenary with Susan Feinstein and Peter Marcuse, at least to address some of this dimension. I don't know how they want to structure that, but maybe some issues can be raised there as well. Another reason for the success of a conference might be also the opportunity to see the materiality of what is often to be considered an ideal city. So the built structure of Urbino. A product of a Renaissance which emerged from new ideas on perspective and form. We have paintings of the ideal city. I hope you will visit, as the rector suggested, in the ideal city painting in the Duke Palace. There are two more, one in Baltimore, which is also on the cover of Cities of Hope of David Harvey's book. We have one in Berlin, where we have been a few years ago. So we are dealing with this challenging concept. But in these paintings, you can hardly see people. It's an ideal city on paper. It's an ideal city which is heritage, of a Renaissance vision of what an ideal city is, and build environment which puts things in a specific perspective. But actually, the ideal cities have to cope with the complexity and unpredictability of everyday life. It's banal to say, but cities are embedded in social, economic, and political contexts. And this conference is actually interested, at the very beginning we were thinking about this, to unveiling, to disentangling in this complexity. How? By questioning the utopian and ideal visions of cities, to putting them in perspective, considering actual agency and current structural changes. So how does socioeconomic change affect cities, their ideal diverse visions? How do poverty and inequality challenge ideal visions and ideal views of a just city? How are ideal cities contrasting real cities affected by segregation, social exclusion practices? In which direction? Who wins? Who loses? Are smart cities smart really for everybody? Probably not. So how do visions and ideals differ across the globe? And how are they questioned by increasingly similar challenges? All sessions are implicitly or explicitly addressing these issues, I think. Another reason why I think this conference was a big success is maybe because cities and the urban fabric are becoming now again, already since a few decades now, a laboratory for social innovation, for developing responses to all these challenges, to the economic changing structure, to politics, to the demographic transformations affecting cities. As the Rector mentioned in his opening, Urbino, besides being a laboratory during the Renaissance, actually was a laboratory also in the 50s, 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. The concept of participatory architecture was developed also within Urbino by Giancarlo De Carlo, who has been challenged by his students as well, but he was developing an idea of entering a dialogue with students, with planners, with architects, with citizens as well. So we think this is an important aspect. I don't know which of these reasons prevails. Probably it's a mix of all of them. And people might even simply like the opportunity to exchange ideas in such a nice setting. So we think LC21 is always providing a nice arena for having such an exchange. And the strength of LC21, and I'm very proud of that, and mention this all the time, is that it is the most interdisciplinary research committee of international sociological associations. So sociologists are a minority within the LC21. And this has probably to do with the fact that complexity and multiplicity of urban forms are challenging our disciplinary approaches. We are not able to understand the city if we are not taking into consideration different approaches. The complexity which is emerging out of the interaction between the different disciplinary knowledge base. And this, we think, is very, very important, and we put forward this in all activities we are carrying out. We think contaminating our views is really one of our main tasks. And this is also one of the reasons why Jeremy Seekins, myself, Eduardo Barberis, Laurent Fouchard have been organizing the 4th IJOR LC21 and 4th summer school. We are organizing it every 2 years. The first one was in Sao Paulo, 2009. It was one in Amsterdam, one in Berlin, one here, and maybe there will be one in St. Petersburg in Russia. We have still to decide, but we are looking to go wherever. And the summer schoolers who are here around, they are 25, they are coming from 20 different countries, from all continents, from all disciplines, and they are bringing into the discussion all their visions, their ideas, their quite diverging opinions on specific issues. They have different sensitivities about the same issue as well. And out of this interaction, I think we can all learn. And I'm thinking that that's very, very important. Let me conclude on a very personal note. I've been actively involved in LC21 since 2002, when I became a secretary, the role that now Alberta Andreotti has. She's somewhere here. And since then, I've been really investing a lot of time and energy and passion in that. And I've learned a lot from my colleagues, interacting in these events, in summer schools, in sessions. And I think my idea of city changed. My idea of what an ideal city might look like has been shaped by this interaction. So I'm very thankful to all of you, because I think it was very important for my professional background, for my personal background. And so how should an ideal city look like for me, at least to me? Diverse, just, social, sustainable, with some little degree of conflict as well, because we think that this should help us avoiding taking for granted views. And we should always be able to address all challenges in a constructive, inclusive, and dialectic way, taking into consideration different views in the solution, in the options we might, in the solutions we attempt to find. And this is also probably one of the reasons why I decided to move to Vienna. Very recently, since March 1st, I moved to Vienna, which is a city where I think these aspects, at least most of them, seem to be present more than in many other large cities. It's a city where segregation is relatively low. We have maybe different types of segregation, but compared to other large cities and metropolitan areas, it's relatively low. It's very social. It has an incredible social housing stock, which is distributed across the city. So you can go also in the most fancy neighborhoods and you have social housing. And I think this was very fascinating to me. The other day I had dinner with Kari Polani-Levitt, the daughter of Karl Polanyi. And I think this context, this ensemble of elements, this period of time produced a legacy which is still now to be perceived in the city, I think. Also, Vienna is changing. We have friends here studying gentrification in Vienna, etc. I fully agree, but if you compare gentrification in Vienna and gentrification elsewhere, the displacement, the harsh displacement which is taking place in other metropolitan areas, I still perceive there is still a big difference, and I think I will appreciate this. So having said this, I will stop. I wish you a very interesting conference, a very fruitful interaction, and thank you very much for being here. We are a bit running late of time, but I would like to pass the word to Eduardo Barberis, who will give you some very important practicalities, so please listen very carefully.
Okay, I'd like to thank you for coming. It's very nice to match the names I saw on the list with faces now. I think we forgot to thank German Wings for yesterday, but some of you know why. And I'd like also to say hello to those people that follow us online, because we are streaming, including my partner, Angela. Hi. And for the afternoon, we will have now the plenary session with David Harvey. After that, we will have the coffee break up at floor A. Then we will have the session, just a small change. Session A1 on smart cities has been moved to tomorrow afternoon. That is, there will be tomorrow morning and tomorrow afternoon. So not today, because there was a problem of transportation with the chair. At 7 o'clock, we will have a welcome drink, which is open to all participants. It will take place at DATA, D-A-T-A. It is located on your map, on the map you have on your bag. We will anyway help to go there from here. I mean, if you get lost in Urbino, you are not good urban scholars. I mean, we would really like to help you to find a way to leave Urbino on Saturday or Sunday. So we are organizing a kind of travel sharing. So please inquire the information desk if you have a transportation to share. Obviously, I have to say that we need to be sharp in time, but now we are not, but we need to do it. We have a bulletin board on the entrance if you need to find communication, institutional communication about changes, or you need to exchange personal communication with other staff. Just another small thing, in the plenary session, when we will have the questions, please come here, because otherwise we just hear your voice, but we cannot take you on the camera. So you have to come in front here for the session, for the question later. That's it, and thank you for coming, and have a good conference.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. So now we have the first plenary, and Eduardo Marques will chair.
Okay. Professor Harvey? we have a presentation? Okay.
No, just
Okay, just ahead. Grazie. Do you have any preferences on when to stay? Anywhere. Yeah, I can stay there. Oh, yeah, that's okay. Just have to read this. So, without further delay, I give the floor to Professor Harvey.
Okay, thanks. I have 2 moments of nostalgia to share. I'm coming to Urbino. One is, of course, encountering the other version of the ideal city in the Ducal Palace. The one I was familiar with was in Baltimore, and so now I've seen 2 of them. I guess I've got to go to Berlin to see the 3rd. But it is a very interesting thing to, painting to look at. The second moment of nostalgia is meeting Enzo Mingioni, who was at the initiation of the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, and I was sort of on the periphery of it, but it was a bunch of very dissident Marxists who were absolutely outraged at the fact they couldn't get things published in the way they wanted to do it, and it was a mixture of the French and the British and Italians and some Americans on the side. But it was, of course, very Marxist. So looking at the program, one of my first reactions is, where the hell is the Marxism? And what has that got to do with ideal cities, and what's that got to do with everything else? And so there's a little bit of a kind of dissidence in a way between, what I've been working on for about the last 15 years, which I call, in retrospect, the Marx project. I say in retrospect because I never knew I was doing it, and it was only about last year I woke up to the fact I had done it. And the project was really based on a number of ideas. One was, I was very irritated by the misinterpretations of Marx, and very irritated also by the fact that most academics who wrote about Marx seemed very, very concerned to make Marx even more complicated than he already was, and that therefore we should be having a project on the left to kind of make Marx as generally available as possible. That led into the video series on Marx's Capital, and led to the companions to Marx's Capital. And the other thing was to show that some of these insights were not just sort of sitting there as philosophical commentaries, but that actually you could set the ideas to use in a whole series of contexts, like the new imperialism, neoliberalism, what was going on in cities, and all the rest of it. And so that produced a whole series of books and so on along these lines. In the course of doing this, I learned a great deal. And in the learning process, I thought that it might be useful to share with you just one element of that, because I think it does have relevance to what we're generally talking about here. When I was doing the companions to volume 1 and 2 of Capital, I kept on thinking to myself, what's the relationship between volume 1 of Capital and volume 2 of Capital? Why is it that they're so differently treated? Why is it that in the world of even Marxist scholarship, volume 1 is much mentioned and much quoted, but nobody touches volume 2? Has that done some harm, if you like, to our understanding of what Marx's project was? And in doing it, so it was sort of in the back of my mind all the time of what the relationship is between the two. And of course, volume 1 is a fantastic literary masterpiece in many ways, and what it does is to talk about the world of production, and production of value and surplus value. And it does it, however, under certain assumptions. of things that don't matter for the purpose of the analysis. Because what Marx is trying to do is to deconstruct the utopianism of classical political economy. That the Smithian view that only let the market do its work and everything will be okay was actually pointing towards a disaster. And that the Smithian utopia of social process, not a spatial form, but the social process that it was said was utopian, was actually dystopian, and that's what Marx was setting out to do. And he did this by writing the analysis of production. But the assumption was that all commodities exchange at their value. It slid in there in a kind of little way. But what that means is you never have a problem when you get to market. That you produce something and it has a certain amount of value, you will realize that value when you go to market automatically. And that is what is the assumption of volume 1. Well, of course, we know that's not true. You know, people often take their commodities to market and can't find the value for it. And so we know it's not true, but nevertheless, that's the assumption he uses. He uses other assumptions too, which is not only that all commodities exchange at their value, but that it really doesn't matter how the surplus value is distributed between interest rate, profit on merchants' capital and all the like. You know, that's all kind of secondary. So he eliminates that from discussion. And then on this basis, he constructs, as I've suggested, a deconstruction of Adam Smith's utopianism, sort of step by step, showing you that that utopianism implies constant pressure on lengthening the working day. And if it's not doing that, it's constantly involved in promoting your technological change and technological and organizational dynamism, and that therefore the capitalist system is perpetually revolutionary in terms of its technologies. And then finally, that capitalism cannot function without a surplus labor army, and that therefore if the surplus labor army cannot be found somewhere, it will be produced by actually producing unemployment by technological means and other means. And it ends up, of course, with the fantastic kind of idea that the dystopian rule is that this system will produce tremendous inequalities of wealth, in which the rich grow richer and richer and richer, and the poor grow relatively poorer and poorer and poorer, and there's increasing immiseration of the working class. And of course, to the degree that we've actually tried to implement this Smithian utopian scheme over the last 30 or 40 years of neoliberalism, what kind of measures do we have of social inequality in the world? Well, you know, Marx is dead right. You know, it produces much more wealth at the top scale, and it leaves the rest of the world in mirth. So this is a very good volume, and it tells you a lot about the dynamics of capitalism. But then you get into volume 2, and something strange happens. The first thing is that he says, I'm going to imagine a society in which there is zero technological change. Now, technological change is the anchor to what happens in volume 1. So suddenly you take away that anchor. And then you say, I'm now going to look at the problems of realization of the value. How does value get realized? And so volume 2 is all about realization of value. And the complications that arise, and why is it that, and how is it that different turnover times make it very difficult to realize the value. I mean, the value of the agricultural producer comes in once a year, but the need for it, the demand for it is spread over the whole year. How do you make that work? How do you deal with fixed capital investments, some of which actually last 15, 20 years? I mean, all these sorts of issues. And Marx kind of says, so the realization of value is a very, very complicated process in which all kinds of things can go wrong, including the big thing that can go wrong is that the capitalists start the day with a certain amount of money, and they launch a certain amount of demand into the economy by buying raw materials, labor power, and all the rest of it, but they expect to get more at the end of the day than they had at the beginning. Where does the more at the end of the day come from? Who's got the money to actually match demand and supply when the supply has been limited and the demand, where is it? So where's the effective demand? This is a Keynesian question, which gets people irritated when they read volume 2, because they realize there's a certain comparison between Marx and Keynes, and so if you spend too much time sort of talking about volume 2, people start accusing you of being a Keynesian. And you kind of go, well, you know, I'm not a Keynesian, I'm just in volume 2, you know, I mean, and by the way, Marx lived before Keynes, didn't you know that? And so you have these sorts of arguments. But one of the important things that comes out of volume 2, which Marx does not state, but which is absolutely crucial to what follows, is that the only way in which you can actually coordinate all of these different turnover times and all the rest of it is that you need the credit system. And you need the credit system because if the only way in which you could replace your fixed machinery was to save money to replace it and keep it under the bed, as it were, then the amount of money dropping out of circulation into hoards would be immense. And it wouldn't only be hoarding of money, hoarding of commodities and all those kinds of things in order to deal with the turnover times. So Marx kind of says the continuity of this of movement of capital is absolutely foundational for how capital works. And the only way that continuity can be assured is through releasing the credit system. But the trouble is, as you release the credit system, as he says, you also release a vehicle of speculation, and a potentially uncontrollable vehicle of speculation. But then this question of what is the relationship between production and realization. So if you take the argument, volume 1 of capital is about production, volume 2 is about realization. Now in the Grundrisse, Marx says something very interesting. He says, you cannot understand capital unless you understand the contradictory unity between production and realization. That is, you cannot understand capital without understanding the contradictory unity between volumes 1 and volumes 2 of capital. And if nobody reads volume 2 of capital, they've missed half of Marx's story. Not even worse than that, you've missed the whole story, because the whole story is about the unity of production and realization and the contradictory unity between the two. And then when you start to say, all right, if that is the case, then we should be looking at the contradictory unity between production and realization. And here you find some extremely interesting bits and pieces which are relevant to the urban case. I'll get round to that eventually. Relevant to the urban case. For example, in the beginning of volume 2, Marx actually lays out a kind of a system of things in which money is used to buy raw materials, which then goes into production, which then produces a commodity, and then that commodity is sold for money plus the profit. And this is a circulation process which is continuous. And Marx looks at that and kind of says we should analyze this. And at first it looks rather sort of banal to say, well, look at the money circuit, look at the production circuit, look at the commodity circuit. But it's not so banal when you start to say, what's the mobility of money? What's the mobility of production? What's the mobility of commodities? And actually you see, of course, radically different mobilities. So the money form of capital has all kinds of capacities and powers that don't exist there for the production. And that in itself can start to organize a contradiction. But even more important, what you see from this kind of flow is that the place and the location of the production of value does not correspond to where that value is necessarily realized. And that therefore there is a tremendous kind of distinction between where value is produced and where it is realized. And then you say, well, how does this work? Well, the simple example of that is Foxconn, that produces your Apple computers. Its rate of return, according to the Financial Times, is only about 3%. It's not making much profit at all. Now, this is where the value is being produced. Apple, which sells the computers all over the world, particularly in the United States, has a rate of return of 27%. What that tells you is that value actually produced in China is realized in the United States. Value which is produced by the direct producers is realized by the merchant capitalist organization. And you start to say, what's been happening in contemporary capitalism since the 1970s? How important are the merchant capitalists, actually, I mean, here we are, not far from the origins of Benetton and all of that. What did they originate? Well, it's a merchant capitalist thing. It doesn't actually produce things. It has them produced somewhere else. So there's a transfer of value going on through this simple kind of circulation process. The same thing starts to happen to wages. wages which are negotiated and struggles which are fought for in the point of production. Okay, workers get higher wages. They then go into the market and they have to actually buy things in the market. What happens when they get to the point where they encounter capital which is being realized and the realizers of the value? And Marx and Engels about 6 times in all of their work, as far as I know, I mean, maybe somebody will find a 7th and 8th, pointed out that actually when the workers take their money home, they actually then encounter another form of exploitation, which is that of the landlord, the shopkeeper, these days, the telephone company, the credit card companies, and all the rest of it. And that therefore there is a politics of realization. And the politics of realization are actually about the extraction of value at the point of realization by organizational forms of capital which are not present at the point of production of value. So this connection then kind of says we have to start thinking about the relationship between what goes on in exploitation in the realm of production, which is a sort of a classic class issue of capital versus labor, to the way in which capital realizes value elsewhere at the point of realization. And where is the point of realization? Well, increasingly, of course, it's in urban daily life. And that therefore urban daily life is actually the scene and arena not only of the classic kind of struggles over capital and labor and production, but is also the scene of extractions of value at the point of realization. But the difficulty here is that the extractions of value at the point of realization don't actually correspond to the working class as generally conceived of at the point of production. In fact, middle-class people get shafted by rising rents and property. Petty bourgeois producers get shafted by the rentiers. And if you kind of say to people generally, you know, what's your main encounter with the world of exploitation? If I say it to students who are not in the workforce, they say the landlord. They say the credit agency, the telephone company, which is constantly ripping us off left, right, and center with hidden charges of this and that. And actually, the amount of wealth that's being recuperated by the capitalist class through the politics of realization is now probably even more significant and more dominant in many parts of the world than the actual exploitation of labor at the point of production. Now, of course, again, there's a geographical difference. If we're talking about China or we're talking about Bangladesh and industrialization in those countries, we're in classic kind of exploitation. But then in this then it also brings us back to the whole kind of question of how do we relate the Volume 1 discussions of practices of production in urban settings with the politics of realization, and what is the unity between the two? Now, Marxists have actually shifted around on this. I mean, Manuel Castells tried to pull back, if you like, the politics of realization through the concept of collective consumption, and so there was some discussion of that way back. But one of the difficulties, it seems to me, is to try to see that all of this is embedded within this unity of the circulation of capital, which is ongoing. And out of this comes kind of saying, well, actually, you can't actually look at this whole thing without looking, for example, at the extractions going on by the rentiers. Now, land and rent right now, and property and all the rest of it, is one of the big areas of extraction. And it's very interesting. If you go to Piketty's book, and you say, all right, there's all this stuff about concentration of wealth in the top 1% and the top 0.1%, 2/3 of that wealth is wrapped up in real estate and property and land. So actually, they're rentiers. They're rentiers as much as they are actually involved in direct producers. So when some crappy politician comes along and tells you, oh, we've got to give more money to the rich so they invest in productive investments, no, they just invested in rents. And now they're getting actually rather desperate for, where can they invest all of their surplus money right now? And there's an interesting phenomenon occurring in cities, which is, of course, that we are increasingly building cities for the wealthy and corporations to invest in, rather than building cities for people to live in. I mean, almost all of the building going on in contemporary New York is for the upper classes, condominiums for the ultra-rich. Mayor Bloomberg's vision of the city, his utopia, and his vision of the right to the city was to turn New York into a place where every billionaire in the world would want to have a penthouse. Didn't matter if they lived there or not. So one of the great things to do in New York right now is to go around, look at all those condominiums and see how many lights are on after 8 o'clock at night, and half of them are empty because they're simply investments. And actually, around the world, you're finding this phenomena going on everywhere, that actually, I mean, I'm in Quito sometimes. I stayed in this place in Quito, and there was only 3 people living in this building of about, 40 apartments, and it was all empty, no interest in actually letting it out. It was simply investing in this case, probably drug money being laundered through it all. Who knows? I mean, that's another story. So if we're building cities for people to invest in, and we're not building cities for people to live in, and this actually generates considerable discontents. So it's not surprising to me that actually over the last few years, most of the social movements that have occurred in discontents over the politics of daily life and the cost of daily life, the price of daily life. I mean, North Africa for many years was a center of food riots again and again and again. So when Tahrir Square, everybody got very surprised, but if you looked at the kind of the history and politics of food riots in the place, then of course you would see that Tahrir Square fitted into something. But this politics of building to invest in, of course, produces speculative bubbles of all sorts, but speculative bubbles which are about investment chasing investment, and we're getting what I would consider a totally insane form of urbanization, which is coming out of this. It's totally insane. I mean, the insanity. I remember taking the high-speed train from Cordoba to Madrid about 6 or 7 years ago. And I went past a city called Ciudad Real. And I went past, and the train went very fast, but literally it was a blur of construction cranes. Just nothing. I mean, I've never seen so many construction cranes. And I got to Madrid, and I said, there's something crazy going on out there, and it's bound to end badly. But when you say things like that, people look at you as if you're insane. But you say, no, I'm very sane, but this looks insane to me. Well, the insanity of it has just been testified to by the fact that they, in Ciudad Real, they built themselves a new airport, huge new airport. It cost billions a year. I don't know how much it cost. And of course, nobody wants to go to Ciudad Real anymore. I mean, there's no tourism there. There's no industry wants to be there. So what's this airport doing there? Well, it's effectively filed for bankruptcy. And they tried to auction it off about a month ago, and the Financial Times reported it was not a very successful auction because the highest bid was 10,000 euros from a Chinese firm. Now, every Spanish city, and I'm sure somebody from Spain will not correct me because I'm not wrong, which had a crazy kind of cultural thing, or they were building something or other and it's all useless. It doesn't add to productivity whatsoever. And then you ask yourself the question, well, why does capital tolerate this? Why wouldn't capital kind of say, look, I mean, there are sensible people in the capitalist class occasionally, and they kind of sometimes say, well, look, this just doesn't make sense, and let's try to stop all of this, and let's try to get the capital back into some sort of reasonable kind of thing. So why is capital allowing this kind of thing to go on? And the answer is, capital has nowhere else to go right now. Capital has actually been in a mess for about the last 30, 40 years, and one of the ways in which it's been getting out of the mess is less and less to invest in anything productive, because it really can't find anything productive to do. What it does is it invests in assets. I mean, the capitalist class, of course, holds most of its assets in Picassos and Degas and things like that. But assets in property and owning things, so that land and urbanization has become one of the vehicles in which surplus capital and labor can be absorbed. And, you know, when Marx was writing, only about 5% of the world was urbanized. Now, you know, more than 50%. I mean, in other words, urbanization, which was a relatively minor issue in Marx's day in terms of the whole dynamics of what a capitalist economy is about, urbanization has now moved center stage. It is the macro power of actually sustaining capital accumulation. And the evidence for that is very strong. Look what China did after the crash of 2008. By early 2009, the export market for China had collapsed in the United States because of the crash in the property markets of the United States. And the Chinese export market crashed, and there were reports that somewhere of the order of 30 million jobs had been lost in the export sector in China. Now, 30 million jobs lost is a hell of a hit. And we know one thing about the Communist Party there is they're very, very nervous about mass unemployment, and they're very, very nervous about social unrest. So their big problem was how to put everybody back to work in such a way that they absorbed capital and labor, but particularly labor. And actually, the IMF, ILO did a study at the end of 2009 that kind of said the net job loss in China had been only 3 million. So somehow or other, the Chinese had managed to recover something like 27 million jobs in 9 months. Now, that is a phenomenal performance. How did it do it? Well, basically, it took every penny it had, and it called on every bank and every municipality and every institution to start building things, build anything, build new cities. They started building whole new cities in the interior of China. They built about 6. Sometimes people say there are 12 cities now which are uninhabited in China. And of course, the Shanghai property market goes crazy. And all of this investment is pouring into real estate. 25% of GDP growth since 2008 in China has been taken up by housing construction alone. And actually, when you add to that all the infrastructures and you know, office spaces and all that kind of stuff, about 50% of Chinese, very close to 50% of Chinese growth has been fixed capital investment in the built environment for about the last 6-7 years. They're rebuilding the city, huge. Now, this is a huge investment in fixed capital. Go back to Marx's Capital, Volume 2, you know, what does it tell you about fixed capital? It says, well, you can absorb stuff into this because nobody knows whether it's going to be productive till, you know, 7 or 8 years down the line. So what's happening right now? Well, China is indebted. China is one of the most indebted countries in the world. Of course, it's not indebted in dollars, which is very convenient. It's just indebted in its own currency. But the debt to GDP ratio is something like 280 to you know, I mean, it's astonishing. The amount of indebtedness. Every municipality in China is severely indebted to the point where it technically probably bankrupt. It makes the sort of New York financial crisis of 1975 look very small. But this launched a huge, huge development project for capital. And what did that do? It forced up raw material prices. China has consumed about 60% of the world's copper over the last 8 years, 50% of the world's iron ore, 50% of the world's cement, and soybeans and all the rest of it. So countries that are heavily connected to the China trade have done very well. Brazil did very well up until, you know, just right now. And Australia did very well. Chile did very well. And the Chinese, of course, have, by that demand for raw materials, have actually done a good job of wrecking much of the world's economy, certainly environmentally, because almost every copper mine that can possibly be exploited at the fastest possible rate is being taken over by the Chinese and utilized. I mean, we often think about, you know, imperialism is just US-based, but if you go to Zambia or somewhere like that, most of the copper being mined in Zambia is mined by Chinese and Indian companies, and this is the kind of world that we are in. So urbanization then, macro urbanization, has taken over in a certain kind of way to actually force development. And almost all those countries that actually managed to come out of the crisis of 2007, 2008 fairly fast did so through the China trade, but also through their own urban development project. So that when you're in Brazil, what is stunning about Brazil is how much urban development there's been in recent times. I mean, Lula's response to the crisis of 2007, 2008 was to say, we're going to build 1 million houses. Didn't say where or when and how much and all this kind of thing, but that was what he, that was the answer. Go into the property market, build cities and the like. So what we've got then is this incredible kind of process in which now the Chinese thing is coming to a halt, and so the property market sort of crashed a couple of years, been having a rough time over the last couple of years. Nobody knows exactly what to do and all the rest of it. So the Chinese have come up with this fantastic project where they're going to build a city of 130 million people. All anchored around Beijing with fast, technologically sophisticated ground transportation networks, so you'll be able to get to one side of the city to another in 60 minutes or something like that. So you kind of go, what does this do to the environment? And there was an incredible statistic in the Financial Times, which I tend to trust, but I'm not sure I trust this one, which said that the Chinese had poured more concrete in the last 2 or 3 years than the United States had poured in the whole of the last century. Now, if you get out of a crisis by pouring concrete everywhere, you then say, what kind of world are we going to be living in? And I've been lucky enough to sort of recently go back to some cities that I went to in Brazil back in the 1970s, like Salvador, Recife, and places like that. And I remember them from the 1970s, and I look at them now, and what are they? I mean, condominiums and high-speed, and shopping malls, and it's amazing. Brazilians like to think they're special, and everything's different in Brazil. And then you take them to a shopping mall and say, "What's different about that?" And they kind of had a hard time answering it. But the thing that you see then is this developmentalism which is going on. But you then ask yourself the question, if say, Salvador and these other countries and Shenzhen and all these other places, or El Alto, were nothing very much in 1970s, and now they've absorbed this vast kind of urbanization kind of project over the last 30 or 40 years. What are we going to say about the next 30 or 40 years? What's this going to look like? And any dreams you may have about utopia will be simply covered in concrete, if the Chinese case has anything to go by. But that case is not actually unique. Istanbul, they have a crazy thing there of actually creating a city of 45 million people by uniting the south and north end of the Bosphorus. And they're building a new airport, typical kind of thing, at the top. Unfortunately, the Turks don't have their own internal financing for it, and so it's coming to a bit of a blockage. And the third bridge over the Bosphorus and everything, trying to create this incredible kind of huge city. So this is the dynamic which is around, and almost everywhere you go, and I know Yuri was talking earlier about everybody's coming and they've got their different cultural ideas from India and Brazil and all the rest of it. And yes, indeed they do, and it's very interesting to note the differences. But one thing I would like to draw your attention to is the similarities. The similarities. The fact that all those office buildings look the damn same wherever you go. The fact that the highways are built in the ways they are, and there's traffic everywhere. Sao Paulo is a great example. The economy rests on automobile production, so they produce more and more cars to put on the streets so you can't drive anywhere. So you sit in a traffic jam all day long. I mean, this is a crazy kind of world. And you kind of go, actually, this is a crazy world because there's a great deal of social need out there, obvious social need that needs to be addressed. That building cities for people to invest in does not address the needs of those who need affordable housing in a city. It doesn't address anything. And this is a macro problem. This is not going to be able to solve by an anti-gentrification movement here, because the anti-gentrification movement here may or may not succeed, but don't worry, there'll be another anti-gentrification movement over there. So those of you who are into anti-gentrification studies, you have plenty of them, you can do them, but they're all say that tell the same story. And then you kind of say, well, why are we having this same story? And I think that that is actually something that this conference should be addressing. Why are we having the same story? Why does it look so much the same from one part of the world to the other, rather than actually emphasizing our differences, rather than actually emphasizing the commonalities of the dynamic which is going on, which has everything to do with this kind of question of the relationship between production and realization. There's a real dilemma about production of value and the politics of production of value. Production of value is, in the Marxist tradition, is often looked at as the factory worker, the guy working at General Motors or Ford or Fiat or wherever. Well, most of those factories have diminished or they've become small employers of labor. So in the United States, for example, the three biggest employers of labor back in 1970 were General Motors, Ford, and US Steel. Now, who are the biggest three employers of labor? The holding company of McDonald's, the holding company of Kentucky Fried Chicken, and Walmart. And these are actually the centers. Now, at this point, you kind of say, are they value producing or are they not value producing? And the answer is actually value production has gone in a completely different direction. I get into this thing, many people kind of say, New York doesn't produce anything, it's not value producing. Actually, I stand at the corner of 86th and 2nd Avenue, and I look, and what do I see? I see all these drivers, delivery trucks going back and forth. Marx says transportation is productive of value and surplus value. Okay, so that's value and surplus value producing. So are the bus drivers and the cab drivers, and even the guy on the on the bicycle delivering the Chinese takeout. Then there are other things going on there. On one side of the street, somebody's putting up scaffolding, on the other side, they're taking it down. That's productive of value. Somebody's actually digging up, Con Edison is digging up the road to put in, the electric, and Verizon is doing it the other side. So that's all productive of value. Furthermore, since when is it that producing an automobile is productive of value, but producing a hamburger is not? Actually, producing hamburgers is productive activity. And you start to look at value production in the restaurant business, and you kind of say, actually, Manhattan is a center of massive amounts of value production and surplus value extraction. It's just not in the factories, and it's just not organizable in the way that the factory labor was. And it's particularly difficult because the circumstances of that value and surplus value production are complicated by, for instance, in the restaurant business. If you go to an owner of a local restaurant and kind of say, well, how come you're exploiting your workers so much? And the answer is, you think I'm exploiting my workers? You should look at me. I get up at 6 in the morning and I stay here till 10 at night, and I hardly get a living out of this place. And I say, well, where does all the money go? Well, I have to pay the bank the loan, and I have to pay rents. Rents on commercial properties in New York City are highly up, and most of the restaurants are having to close down. People are super exploiting themselves, the owners, to stay in business, to pay who? The rentiers and the financiers. We're living in a world in which the rentiers and the financiers are actually parasitically sucking dry most of the wealth. And they're doing it through an accumulation process which is actually now structured. And it's structured through austerity politics and structural adjustment programs of the IMF, which actually are the politics of what I would call accumulation by dispossession. That actually you're dispossessing people of their wealth. And of course that happened in the foreclosures when, 10, 15 million people lost their houses in New York, in the United States, and asset values of the African Americans diminished by about 3/4, and of Hispanic migrants and white population, about 1/3. So here's the politics of it. And hardly surprisingly, what we're seeing is outbursts of urban unrest. That is, there are some wonderful things about urban life still, but there is deep discontents with the qualities of daily life. And I think that from a left perspective, the politics of daily life are the politics of realization, which have to be understood in terms of this dynamic in which capital accumulation has changed its spots into an increasing concentration on the politics of realization as being the place where it can best organize itself and has organized itself. So that, you know, again, the telephone company, the credit card company, and in particular the landlord, they're making out like crazy. And this is the macro context in which it seems to me that much of what we understand as the urban process is occurring. And yes, there are ways in which it can be reformed. Yes, there are ways in which it can be dealt with. But my own view is that there's a limit to which that can happen. That actually capital accumulation forever at a compound rate has come to an end. It's not going to be able to do it anymore, except by actually investing in assets, doing this stuff with property, you know, chewing up urban areas, dispossessing people here, ripping people off there. And what we're likely to see is, as we have seen over the last 15 years, is we're going to see outbreaks of urban protest. More and more outbreaks of urban protest. Most of the big protests have been, you know, like Gezi Park and so on, a protest over the qualities of urban life. And they're not led by the classical working class because, you know, they may be supported by that element of the classical working class that's left. It's a different class configuration. It can also include middle class, petty bourgeois. There is, in fact, the grounds for a clear alliance of forces across many, many, many different groups in the population to kind of say we've got to stop this, but you can't stop it at the local level. Somehow or other, capital accumulation has to be defanged. Somehow or other, this kind of penchant for increasing concentration of wealth and power has to be stopped. And only in those terms, it seems to me, will you be in a position to start to talk about a decent living environment for living in, and a decent politics of daily life in urban settings. And these are the dynamics which seem to me to be very, very crucial. And at the same time, to me, this turns me very much into the idea that I'm an anti-capitalist, and I'm an anti-capitalist not because I'm insane, but because I'm sane. And I think this is very important, because, you know, when you say you're an anti-capitalist, people think you're off your rocker. No, I'm incredibly sane. At this point, it then goes back to saying, well, how do we get to get the theoretical analysis? How can we get the popular understanding that kind of says, this system cannot possibly last. We have to grapple with it in certain ways, which actually mobilizes on the basis of urban life, and I think that can be done. And there are some very interesting sort of experiments going on with that in Rojava and places like that, where you get a Bookchin-style sort of reconfiguration of governmental activities and power. Are there ways in which we could somehow or other mobilize all of these bits and pieces of solidarity economies, of cooperatives, of factory takeovers, and communal activities? Is there some way in which that can be turned into a much more powerful kind of movement that is no longer ephemeral, as most of these urban movements have been, and has staying power, and which understands that the only way in which you're going to actually get somewhere in terms of transforming urban life in a direction that makes any sense from the standpoint of the mass of the population is to actually turn into an anti-capitalist politics. And I think actually people are ready for that in a curious kind of way. And I think that the media is horrified. And I think the capitalist class is horrified when even somebody as mild as Jeremy Corbyn can actually maybe become leader of the British Labour Party. How Bernie Sanders, who's an acclaimed socialist, actually pulls in large crowds, and the people are getting terrified for very good reason, because a lot of people are saying enough is enough. But somehow or other, there's not the leadership around, there is not the movement around, there is not the coherent analysis around, which is collectively going to actually impact the political situation. And I think a conference like this should address the question of how do we make a collective impact. It's not simply about, oh, I have an interesting study on this and you have an interesting study on that. It's, all right, how do we put it all together? And what kinds of statements do we make? And what kinds of politics do we try to transform? In other words, I am getting nostalgic. I wish I was back in 1970 when we thought revolution was around the corner. Now we don't think it's anywhere. And I think actually it is around the corner. And I think we better be ready for it. Thanks.
Thanks, Professor Harvey, for this wonderful lecture. We still have 20 minutes, so I'm opening the word to the floor. I have some questions also, but yes. As Yuri or Eduardo explained, the persons who have questions have to come here, unfortunately, to be recorded. Otherwise, our colleagues who are seen through the internet won't be able to follow. This is working now.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that. I'm Robin Stott. I'm a physician, and of the same generation as you, with the same optimism for a new revolution. But the question I'd like to ask is, where does the environmental crisis fit into all this? Because I think, to me, that's the other major part of our urban discontent, is a dislocation that we feel between our normal life, that we're in the life of the planet. So I'd like your comments and thoughts on where that fits into this.
It complicates everything. And, but for very good reason, and I think that in the 17 Contradictions book, I mentioned that there were three, what I thought were fundamentally dangerous contradictions. One is the contradiction of compound growth forever, and I think we're at an inflection point in the compound growth of capital accumulation, which cannot possibly last. The second dangerous contradiction is the environmental dynamics. But I think you have to be a little careful about this. I'm very much at war is not the right word, but I'm not impressed with the apocalyptic side of what some environmentalists proclaim. Capitalism has actually been very successful at negotiating its environmental constraints, and frankly, it doesn't care if species get eliminated. So what? So capital can survive perfectly well a lot of environmental destruction, and as we see, can even make a lot of profit off it. So I don't think capital itself is actually facing a crisis of the environment, at least one that it cannot manipulate to its own advantage. So the question then arises as to what do anti-capitalists say and do, and what is the issue for anti-capitalists? The issue, I think, is not to say that we are not supposed to engage in environmental disturbances. In fact, historically, humanity has been very sophisticated in its reshaping of environments, and we are a major evolutionary force. And the only interesting question is evolutionary in what direction? And I think this then leads to, you know, can we actually engage constructively with the environment? When you encounter a beautiful landscape, which you find extremely satisfying to look at, and you kind of discover that this is actually humanly constructed, then you kind of say, well, there's nothing that stops us constructing new landscapes, which, and then that gets back to aesthetic questions, and it also gets back to what I would say is the third big problem of our time, which I call universal alienation. And I think that the sense of alienation from what we generally refer to as natural processes, I don't like to do that technically, but let me use it, that phrase, that our alienation is such as to create a massive sense of loss, that we are not making the kinds of environments which are satisfying to live in, beautiful to live in, sustainable if you want, although I hate that term because everything is sustainable. Everybody wants something to be sustainable. Nobody's in favor of unsustainability, and it's one of those sort of empty words. But yes, no, the environmental issue is a big one, and how and what we construct and how. But here, I think a great deal of cultural variability is significant and important, because I think that different peoples in different places will construct entirely different environmental configurations. Indigenous groups will do it one way, and we will do it another way. And then there's a question of how indigenous ecosystems relate to other ecosystems which are built by other population. What I've seen in Amazonia is a capitalist ecosystem just crashing into and destroying other ecosystems around it in such a way as to destroy the livelihoods and the cultural meaning of the populations who are dwelling there. This is an inadmissible practice. And so, you know, again, that question has to be put into the discussion, but I think it has to be put in as a creative question rather than thou shalt not disturb the environment. Frankly, we disturb it all the time, and sometimes we disturb it in ways which make it a better place for us to live in, and actually make it a better place for all kinds of creatures to live in. But you know, we don't need to take that apocalyptic imaginary that somehow or other the whole world is going to collapse in 5 years because of global warming or something like that, because global warming, again, is a great opportunity for capital to go out and do things and build things, and, you know, so it's not antagonistic to capital at all. And I think that is something that we need to take into account.
Please. Okay. While Professor Feinstein is phrasing her question, I'm taking notes of the persons. Okay. Just raise your hand if you want to.
Well, I think you're quite right, David, that looking at the program, one sees a number of disparate studies which don't particularly focus on the questions that RC21 did back when we were younger. Yeah. But in your talk, you didn't discuss at all what is, in fact, causing the greatest urban unrest right now, which is, on the one hand, rebellion against discrimination, but on the other hand, very strong right-wing reactionary movements. And when I was in the airport on the way here, CNN was playing a talk by Donald Trump in Iowa, and I mean, this man was literally ranting. It was somewhat reminiscent, I think, of certain people in the 1930s, if not Hitler, people like Father Coughlin. And that I see these very powerful right-wing movements, which may be coming out of the alienation you discuss, but I don't see a great current of hopefulness.
Yeah, alienation produces frequently passivity punctuated by aggressive outbursts, and the aggressive outbursts can be to the left, to the right, up, down, all over the place. Alienation can also be manipulated into scapegoating and the like, and we've seen the rise of racial discriminations, and of course one of the big issues which we're faced with, which I didn't talk about, was the problem of, you know, having a relatively short time, which is, of course, is the way in which the state in many parts of the world has been reconfigured into a militarized repressive apparatus. And how to confront that militarized repressive apparatus and its promotion of frequently right-wing sort of ideas and practices. This is a very serious issue right now, and I think that this is something that is going to be fought out in the streets. I think we'll hear from Raquel tomorrow about the Brazilian case, where I think that you see this mix of. And I was just in Ecuador, where we had exactly the same thing, but this has a lot to do with the collapse of the economic project in Ecuador and Latin America in general, which has a lot to do with the collapse of the Chinese project, and the fact that the wealth that was flowing into Brazil and was flowing into Ecuador and so on through the Chinese connection and is now petering out, and that the promises that were being made by these interim governments of kind of left-leaning but not revolutionary by any means, that this has actually created a space in which right-wing forces can mobilize. I think the cases which we're looking at right now in Europe are, I mean, Hungary is already kind of completely sort of fascist, and the rise of neo-fascism throughout Europe is scary. There's a general anticipation. One of the fears about Syriza in Greece is that if Syriza fails, Golden Dawn will take over. And so, yes. The only hope I have about Donald Trump is that he managed to bankrupt 3 companies and come out of it, so maybe if he becomes president, he'll bankrupt the United States, and then the world might be a rather more better place. That is a joke, by the way.
Thank you, Professor Harvey, for your very inspiring speech. By the way, I'm Franz Gatzweiler. I'm working for an ICSU program on urban health and well-being, taking a systems approach. My question is, why has society failed to make value realization happen to where people think it's worthwhile? That means a follow-up question, why have people failed, or why has society failed to set up the feedback and response mechanisms in order to make urbanization a place not of our discontents, but of our happiness?
My goodness, you asked easy questions. If I knew exactly why everything had failed, I would tell you, and we wouldn't do it again. But I think there are a lot of there's a complicated history here. I think that to some degree, the politics of realization were organized in certain parts of the world through social democracy. And even in the United States, where there was no social democracy, the politics of realization was still partially orchestrated through state action and state activities. Now, there were many discontents with that state manipulated social wage approach to the politics of realization. Discontents at all kinds of levels. And, I could go into a lengthy critique of the welfare state as it arose at the end of the 1960s, early 1970s. Many people on the left, including myself, were highly critical of the welfare state. We wanted to actually dissolve it because the state organization of that was not effective. Now, of course, we look back and, and say we should have been more careful about what we wished for, because we got the dissolution of state activism in terms of social provision, and the politics of realization was then left to individuals, and we get the individualized approach saying basically everybody's responsible for their own politics of realization, and that introduces all kinds of competition. I mean, and I think Foucault was right in his thing about, governance and so on, that actually the neoliberal shift was a shift from the state policing you to self-policing. And so that introduces a certain kind of political subjectivity into a population that means it is, not political in the same way. And so there are many issues of that kind which happened through the neoliberalization. But one of the things I would point out to people here, this was a slow process. I mean, Margaret Thatcher set out to change the soul, she said. She wanted to change the mentalities. And again, I would take Marx's arguments that mental conceptions of the world are absolutely crucial to the way in which a political project unfolds. And there's no question that mental conceptions of the world shifted from, say, 1970 to 1990 through 20 years of neoliberal assault. And as those mental conceptions change, so people kind of effectively have to take care of their own realization. Their own realization politics, and it becomes individualized, which means capital then can actually easily, attack an individualized population. Occasionally, everybody gets together and says, "Hey, listen, this social movement is, the practices of the telephone company are appalling," and they, so something happens to change that. But I think there's a whole history of that, and that again comes back to, well, to the degree that mental conceptions of the world were changed over a 20-year period, we have a lot of work to do to change mental conceptions. Now, that doesn't say changing mental conceptions changes the world. It does not. But you can't change the world without changing mental conceptions. So one of the jobs we have, part of the division of labor, is to try to, change mental conceptions. And to do it in such a way that kind of says the collectivity is the only way to work, and we have to see that actually in this era when we're supposed to have competition going on everywhere, in fact, we're being attacked by monopolies. The only people who are competitive right now, it's neoliberal competition for the working population and everybody else. And it's monopoly power for the pharmaceutical companies and for the oil companies and everything else. So when you look at that kind of thing, and and everybody wants to talk about decentralization, and the left is very, very, very interested in decentralization and very antagonistic to government. But then you kind of say, well, Ronald Reagan was like that too. So the left has to, I think, understand that sometimes it's acting as a mirror image of the very, very system it's trying to critique. And to the degree it becomes a mirror image, it actually becomes a facilitative opposition as opposed to a real opposition. When the real opposition has to smash that mirror and say we need to get somewhere else in our politics rather than in this politics of, decentralized, which is, capitalists like it when you decentralize. I mean, it's fine. Just go off and decentralize. Just don't challenge our power. And of course, you don't challenge their power. And I think that the question right now is how to challenge that power.
We still have 2 questions. Maybe we could, now we have 3, I think. Professor Marcuse? So we have 3 questions. Maybe we could, no? So 2 questions. The first one is from the back. Sorry, you have to come here. If you could please summarize.
Yes.
And then we do the 2 questions together, and Professor Harvey answers them together.
Thank you so much, your excellent speech. I'm from China. I'm a Chinese scholar. I just appreciate mention Marxism. I think you know Chinese government implement Marxism, right? But how to think now Chinese government implement Marxism to development the countries and urbanization. Other questions, how to stop Chinese crazy to development urbanization. It's okay, thank you.
Thank you.
No, she gave up.
You gave up?
Professor Marques?
I think you've started to answer the question that I was going to ask in terms by speaking about mental conceptions. The question is the urbanization of our discontents. Discontent with what? Originally in Marx, it had to do with impoverishment, material impoverishment. I think the discontent today is probably not simply with poverty in the sense of living below the poverty line, but is much more ideological or psychological. What is the opposite of alienation? Is the conception that we want the conception of the ideal city, and if this conference is successful, we will have solved the problem of alienation?
Yeah. First, the developmentalism in China and its relationship to Marxism. This is I'm not an expert on how the Chinese are approaching these issues. But what struck me, a sort of partial truth in Giovanni Arrighi's book on Adam Smith in Beijing, was that Adam Smith did not advocate free markets and no state power. Adam Smith was giving advice to statesmen. And his advice to statesmen was, if you want your state to grow rich and wealthy, then you don't interfere with market prices and things like that within the state. You actually liberate the state internally, and that will generate wealth. This was Adam Smith's recommendation to statesmen. He actually said in various points that if the wealth, once it's generated, is maldistributed, the state should actually get involved in redistributions. So Adam Smith was not opposed to redistributions. But I think what the Chinese government appears to have learned from a reading of Adam Smith was that their failure to develop wealth and power to ward off the power of the United States as a supreme imperialist power, that the way they should do that was to have some sort of quasi-liberation of competitive markets within China, albeit under highly centralized control. But they then had this dilemma of labor absorption. Most of the countries that I'm deeply familiar with are obsessed with capital absorption. They don't care about labor absorption. Disposable human beings are being created all the time, and the capitalist state doesn't care about that. What they care about is how to deal with the surplus value which is accumulating. The Chinese, however, I think are very concerned about labor absorption, and I don't know whether this is for ideological reasons or political reasons or historical reasons. And the labor absorption requires certain forms of activity, and I think they've got themselves into the dilemma that if they had not engaged in that huge urbanization project after 2008, they would have been in real serious trouble with 30 million unemployed. Very serious trouble. Now, some of the things that then went on in China were interesting. I mean, there was the Chongqing model, which led, of course, to Bo being thrown out, and there seems to be some competition between the Shanghai model and the Chongqing model or something like that. I don't know quite. You tell me the details. But now China is in a very difficult, extremely difficult moment. Can it reestablish its export markets? Some people say the devaluation of the currency was a move in that direction. Maybe. Can it develop an internal absorption model like this crazy city project they have? I think they don't know what to do. And I think that it's now recognized. In fact, I've been saying this for some time, and finally the Financial Times recognized it today by saying basically global capitalism survived after 2009 because of China. And now China's in trouble, so we are in trouble. Maybe the United States is still a very powerful economy, equally powerful to China. Maybe the United States can now take the lead. I think that's about the only hope for global capitalism to come out of this mess. And I don't see that China has anywhere to turn other than doing what it has been doing. In terms of discontents, what are we discontented about? I think that, poverty, you're right, it's not that. I think there's a question of what people are discontented about and a question of what they should be discontented about. My view of what people should be discontented about is the performance of capitalist economies, and that therefore the discontent should be with capital in all its forms: financial, mercantile, merchant capital, production, agrarian, mining, oil. We should be deeply discontent with the way in which their power is being concentrated, and their power is being concentrated and centralized in such a way that it dominates the media, which is why, for example, that people like you and I, Peter, can't get on the major radio stations. And why there is this ideological control. So yes, we can be discontent with the ideological control. And academically, intellectually, we should be ones to be able to challenge that. But frankly, most universities have become hotspots of neoliberal replication and corporatism, with finance dominating in many instances. That if you want to found a new economics department, we'll find you a big donor who will actually found the economics department, provided you only teach Hayek and Milton Friedman. Very easy to do these days. And of course the mass media, same sorts of problem. So yeah, we can be discontent about lots of things. We can be discontent about all these manifestations, the inequalities, all the sorts of things the Occupy movement was talking about. We can be discontent with the failure to respond to environmental issues in a way which makes sense. We can be discontent with all these manifestations. And in fact, probably if you go around the room right now and say, what are you discontented about, we'd find as many discontents as there are individuals. But all those discontents, it seems to me, have to be located somewhere against that which has to change in order for us not to be discontented in the way we are right now. We may be discontented in other ways, but then you make a choice of what kinds of discontents you want to live with and which kinds you don't. My view is that we should be discontented with capitalism, and that we should be anti-capitalist, and that there should be anti-capitalist movement. And yes, there are lots of other social movements around that are anti-this and anti-that, but there aren't many around, I know, which actually claim full-frontedly they're anti-capitalist or even understand exactly what anti-capitalism might mean. And I was trying to define that in the last book on 17 contradictions to sort of say, well, what did it mean to be an anti-capitalist? And why should you be an anti-capitalist? And that's one of the couple of the big questions which confront us. And yes, the mass discontents can be all over the place, but I think that precisely our political problem right now is to bring those discontents together into a configuration that has enough political power to actually change the world in ways which are away from the trajectory, the evolutionary trajectory upon which capital is embarked. And I think a clear understanding of what that evolutionary trajectory is a necessary precondition for understanding why it is that we need to actually change directions and in what ways we might be able to change directions, not in a utopian sense of just imagining something different, but concretely think about an organizational politics.
Thanks a lot, Professor Harvey. Now we close this session. Now we have to move to the first floor. First?
Well, here in this building, there is no first and second.